The winter air in Tokyo felt different on December 8, 1941. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood by the window of his office in the imperial headquarters, watching the sun rise over the city. In his hand, he held a telegram that confirmed what he already knew. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The American Pacific Fleet lay damaged in Hawaiian waters. Japan had struck first and struck hard. Around him, the celebration had already begun. Young officers rushed through the hallways with bottles of sake, their voices loud with triumph. Colonel Ishida burst into the room, his face flushed with excitement. The reports were better than anyone had dared to hope. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 20 other ships hit. Almost 200 aircraft turned to burning metal. American casualties numbered in the thousands. Ishida spread the papers across Yamamoto's desk with shaking hands. The numbers told a story of complete surprise and devastating success. Japanese losses were minimal by comparison. 29 aircraft lost. 5 midget submarines gone. Less than 100 men dead. It seemed like a miracle, a sign from the gods themselves that Japan's cause was righteous and unstoppable. In the main war room downstairs, General Hideki Tojo addressed the gathered commanders. His voice carried the weight of absolute confidence. The Americans had been caught sleeping, he declared. Their navy was crippled. Their will to fight would crumble when they realized the cost of war with the Empire of Japan. He predicted the Americans would sue for peace within 6 months, perhaps sooner. The room erupted in applause. Maps on the walls showed Japanese forces sweeping across the Pacific like a typhoon. Hong Kong would fall within days. The Philippines were already under heavy assault. Singapore, the British fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, would be next. Every calculation, every war game, every strategic plan seemed to be working perfectly. Lieutenant Sato, barely 25 years old, spoke up during the briefing. He had studied in California before the war. He suggested that perhaps the Americans might be more resilient than expected. The room fell silent for a moment before laughter broke out. An older captain clapped him roughly on the shoulder and told him not to worry. Americans were soft, he said. They cared more about their cars and movies than about fighting. They would not sacrifice their comfortable lives for a war across the ocean. But Yamamoto did not laugh. He had spent years in America, first as a student at Harvard University, then traveling across the vast country. He remembered the endless wheat fields of Kansas that seemed to stretch to the horizon. He recalled the automobile factories in Detroit, massive buildings where thousands of workers assembled cars with mechanical precision. He thought of the oil fields in Texas, the steel mills in Pittsburgh, the shipyards in California. America was not just large. It was a sleeping industrial giant. That evening, Yamamoto sat alone in his office again. The celebration continued outside, but he could not join it. He opened his journal and began to write. His hand moved slowly across the paper, forming characters that expressed his deepest fear. They had achieved surprise. They had won a tactical victory. But strategy was different from tactics. War was not won in a single morning. That he wrote about his time in America, about the things that troubled him. The Americans had seemed casual about their strength, almost unaware of it. They argued constantly among themselves, their politicians fighting in public, their newspapers criticizing their own government. It looked like weakness to outsiders. But Yamamoto had seen something else. He had seen a people who could disagree about everything until the moment they were threatened. Then they would unite with frightening speed that a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Commander Nakamura entered with more reports from across the Pacific. The news continued to be good. Japanese forces were advancing everywhere. American and British troops were retreating. The colonial powers that had dominated Asia for so long were being pushed back by Japanese strength and courage. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was becoming reality. Nakamura noticed Yamamoto's somber expression and asked if something was wrong. The admiral looked at the young officer for a long moment before speaking. He explained that they had not sunk any American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. The carriers had been at sea, away from the harbor. Those carriers still existed, still threatened Japanese operations. More importantly, America's industrial base remained completely untouched. Their factories, their oil refineries, their training facilities, all of them continued to operate 3,000 miles away across the Pacific. The commander tried to reassure him. Japan's warriors were superior, he argued. Japanese pilots trained harder and longer than Americans. Japanese soldiers embraced the code of Bushido, willing to die for the emperor. How could American factory workers and farmers stand against such dedication? Yamamoto did not argue. There was no point. The young man would learn the truth in time, just as they all would. Late that night, Yamamoto completed his journal entry with words that would become famous long after the war ended. He wrote that he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The attack had been brilliantly executed. The tactical victory was real. But he could not shake the feeling that they had made a catastrophic strategic mistake. Japan had won the battle, but the war, the real war, had only just begun. Outside his window, Tokyo continued to celebrate. Lanterns lit up the streets. Music played. People danced. They believed the war was already won. Yamamoto closed his journal and locked it in his desk. Time would tell if his fears were justified. He hoped desperately that he was wrong. But in his heart, in the part of himself that understood America's true nature, he knew he was right. The giant was awake now, and giants, once roused, were very difficult to put back to sleep. Commander Nakamura's hands trembled as he read the telegram for the third time. The words had not changed. They would not change no matter how many times he read them. For aircraft carriers lost. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all gone to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean near a tiny island called Midway. It was June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and everything had changed. The war room at Imperial headquarters felt different now. The maps still covered the walls, showing Japanese territory stretched across the Pacific. But the confident voices from December had grown quieter. Officers moved with less certainty. The sake bottles stayed unopened. Something had shifted in the air itself, like the pressure change before a storm. General Tojo entered the room, and the staff immediately stood at attention. His face showed nothing, but everyone present could sense his anger. The Battle of Midway was supposed to be Japan's greatest naval victory. Admiral Yamamoto had planned it carefully. The goal was to lure out the remaining American carriers and destroy them. Instead, Japan had suffered the worst naval defeat in its history. The casualty reports painted a grim picture. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen dead. Hundreds of aircraft lost. 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval power, now resting on the ocean floor. And for what? The Americans had lost only 1 carrier, the Yorktown. 1 carrier versus 4. The mathematics of war had turned against Japan in a single day. Lieutenant Saito, one of the few pilots who survived the battle, stood before the assembled officers to give his report. His flight suit still smelled of smoke and salt water. His eyes had the distant look of a man who had seen too much. He described the battle in careful detail, his voice flat and emotionless. The American fighters had come in waves, he explained. The Japanese pilots shot them down, one after another. Saito himself had destroyed 3 American aircraft, but more kept coming. For every plane they shot down, 2 more appeared. The sky became thick with aircraft, more than he had ever seen in any training exercise or previous battle. It was not supposed to be possible. Where had they all come from? Then the American dive bombers arrived. Saito watched from his cockpit as they fell on the Japanese carriers like hawks on mice. The Akagi caught fire first, flames spreading across her deck. Then the Kaga exploded, a mushroom of smoke and debris rising hundreds of feet into the air. The Soryu and Hiryu tried to maneuver, but the Americans kept coming. It was relentless, mechanical, inevitable. After Saito finished his report, Colonel Ishida stood to present the intelligence findings. What he revealed shocked even the most experienced commanders in the room. American industrial production had increased dramatically since December. The factories that Yamamoto had warned about were working at full capacity now and beyond. New shipyards had been built. Existing ones had doubled their workforce. Women who had never worked outside their homes were now welding steel and riveting aircraft wings. The numbers seemed impossible. Ishida had initially refused to believe them, thinking they were American propaganda designed to intimidate Japan. So he sent multiple intelligence teams to verify the information through neutral sources and capture documents. The numbers were real. America was building more ships in a month than Japan could build in a year. Aircraft production had tripled. Tank production had quadrupled. The American economy had transformed into a war machine of staggering proportions. An older admiral interrupted Ishida's presentation with a question. How could the Americans, who seemed so divided and argumentative, organize such production? Ishida explained what Japanese intelligence had learned. After Pearl Harbor, something unexpected happened in America. The political fighting stopped almost overnight. Labor unions agreed to work longer hours. Companies that normally competed began sharing technology and resources. The entire nation united with a single purpose. Nakamura added more disturbing information from his own intelligence network. American military training camps were graduating new soldiers every week. The recruits came from farms, offices, and factories. They were not professional warriors like Japanese soldiers, but they were adequate, and there were endless numbers of them. Quality might favor Japan, but quantity had a quality all its own. The discussion grew heated. Some officers insisted that Japanese spirit and training would overcome American industrial advantage. Captain Tanaka, recently returned from Guadalcanal, disagreed sharply. He described fighting against Americans who seemed to have unlimited ammunition, unlimited supplies, unlimited reinforcements. Every night, Japanese forces would destroy American positions. Every morning, new Americans would arrive with fresh equipment to replace what was lost. General Tojo finally spoke, silencing the debate. He acknowledged that the war had become more difficult than expected. But retreat was impossible. Japan had committed itself to creating the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The divine emperor's will could not be questioned. Victory might take longer than originally planned, but it would still come. It had to come. The alternative was unthinkable. After the meeting ended, several junior officers gathered quietly in a side room. They spoke in whispers about things that could not be said openly. One mentioned Yamamoto's warning from December about awakening a sleeping giant. Another noted that the giant appeared to be very much awake now. A third wondered quietly if perhaps peace negotiations might be possible before things got worse. But none of them dared speak such thoughts where senior officers might hear. In Japan's military culture, suggesting anything other than total victory was considered defeatist. It could end a career or worse. So they kept their doubts private and continued to serve. They would follow orders. They would fight with courage. But in their hearts, a new fear had taken root. Nakamura returned to his desk that night and updated his intelligence files. 6 months ago, he had been celebrating Japan's victories. Now he was documenting defeats and tried to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. He thought about Midway, about the 4 carriers burning in the Pacific, about the endless waves of American aircraft. The war was far from over, but the certainty of victory had died somewhere in the waters near that tiny island. The photographs spread across the conference table looked like something from a nightmare. Admiral Koga stared at them in silence, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Reconnaissance planes had taken the pictures over American shipyards in California and along the East Coast. The images showed dozens of ships under construction simultaneously. Not just a few vessels, but entire fleets being built at the same time. WWII was now 1943, and Koga had replaced Yamamoto as commander of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's plane was shot down over the Solomon Islands. He inherited not just the command, but also the terrible truth that Yamamoto had understood from the beginning. Japan could not win a war of production against America. The question was no longer if Japan would lose, but how badly and how soon. Colonel Ishida pointed to specific details in the photographs. The Americans had developed a new construction method they called prefabrication. Instead of building ships piece by piece in the traditional way, they built large sections in factories and then assembled them quickly at the shipyards. A Liberty cargo ship that should take months to build was now being completed in weeks. One shipyard had built a vessel in just 4 days, though that was considered a publicity stunt. Still, it showed what was possible. The numbers Ishida presented made several officers gasp. Japan had built approximately 5,000 aircraft in 1942. America had built over 47,000. In 1943, American production was expected to reach 85,000 aircraft. 85,000. The number seemed so absurd that Captain Tanaka suggested it must be propaganda, a line meant to discourage Japanese forces. Ishida shook his head. They had verified the numbers through multiple intelligence sources. If anything, the Americans were producing even more than the estimates suggested. A junior intelligence officer named Watanabe presented his findings about American factories. Before the war, automobile companies like Ford and General Motors had built millions of cars. Now those same factories were building tanks, aircraft, and military vehicles instead. The assembly line techniques that made cars quickly and cheaply were being applied to weapons of war. American industrial capacity was not just large. It was adaptable and efficient in ways Japanese industry could not match. The report continued with more disturbing details. American oil production dwarfed Japanese oil supplies. While Japan struggled to secure fuel from conquered territories in Southeast Asia, America pumped oil from vast fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Gasoline rationing in America was relatively mild. In Japan, fuel was already becoming scarce, and the war was only in its second year. General Anime stood to share reports from field commanders. The pattern was consistent across all theaters of war. Japanese forces fought with incredible courage and skill. They won tactical battles, but they could not win the strategic war. Captain Yamada wrote from Guadalcanal, describing how American supplies arrived by ship constantly. When Japanese forces destroyed American positions at night, new fortifications would appear by morning, as if by magic. The Americans simply had too much of everything. Another commander described the air war over the Solomon Islands. Japanese pilots were among the best trained in the world, with years of experience. They shot down American planes regularly. But American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of new pilots every month. When an experienced Japanese pilot died, he was irreplaceable. Japan did not have the resources to train replacements quickly. When an American pilot died, 3 more arrived within weeks to take his place. The quality versus quantity argument had been settled. Quantity won. Japanese Zeros were superior to American fighters at the start of the war. But Americans learned, adapted, and built new aircraft that matched or exceeded Japanese performance. Then they built those new aircraft by the thousands. The Corsair, the Hellcat, the Lightning, all these new American planes appeared in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese forces through sheer volume. Koga asked the question everyone was thinking. Could Japan negotiate peace while still holding some territorial gains? Perhaps offer to withdraw from certain areas in exchange for keeping others? The room fell silent. No one wanted to answer. Finally, an old admiral spoke carefully. America had declared it would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. President Roosevelt had made this clear. There would be no negotiated peace. The war would continue until Japan was completely defeated. This reality hung over the meeting like a dark cloud. Japan had started the war believing in a quick victory. Now, less than 2 years later, the military leadership understood they were trapped. They could not win, but they could not surrender. Japanese military culture made surrender unthinkable. The code of Bushido demanded fighting to the death. But fighting to the death would mean the destruction of Japan itself. Intelligence reports described a new American strategy called island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, the Americans would bypass some and conquer others, moving steadily toward Japan. Each conquered island became a base for further operations, an airfield for bombers, a harbor for ships. The American advance was methodical, mechanical, and unstoppable. It was like watching a machine slowly grinding forward, crushing everything in its path. Watanabe presented information about the American home front that seemed almost impossible to believe. Despite the war, American civilian life continued relatively normally. People still went to movies. Baseball games still happened. Factories ran 3 shifts, but workers still had days off. The war was serious, but it had not consumed American society the way it consumed Japanese society. America was fighting a total war without actually mobilizing totally. They were winning while holding back. The meeting ended with no decisions made because no good decisions were available. The officers filed out silently, each lost in his own thoughts. They would continue fighting because that was their duty. They would continue issuing orders, planning operations, and hoping for miracles. But in their hearts, they knew the truth. Japan had challenged a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, unlimited resources, and an angry determination to win. It was not a fair fight. It had never been a fair fight. Koga remained alone in the conference room after everyone left. He looked again at the reconnaissance photographs of American shipyards. Somewhere in those images was Japan's future. It was written in steel and rivets, in the endless rows of ships being born from American factories, in the unstoppable tide of industrial might that Japan had awakened when it attacked Pearl Harbor. Field Marshal Sugiyama looked at the map with eyes that had long ago stopped showing surprise. It was early 1945, and the map of Japanese territory had been shrinking for months. Red pins marked American advances. Blue pins marked Japanese positions that still held, but barely. The Philippines were lost. Iwo Jima was under assault. Okinawa would be next. Tokyo itself now lay within range of American bombers. The meeting room at Imperial headquarters felt suffocating despite the winter cold outside. General Anami read the latest casualty reports in a monotone voice. The Battle of Iwo Jima was costing Japan thousands of soldiers. Mount Suribachi had fallen. American Marines raised their flag on its summit, a photograph that would circle the world and become a symbol of American determination. The Japanese garrison fought with desperate courage, but courage alone could not stop artillery, naval bombardment, and flamethrowers. Lieutenant Watanabe presented the air raid reports. The previous night, over 300 American B-29 bombers had struck Tokyo. Not military targets specifically, but the city itself. The bombers carried incendiary weapons designed to start fires. In a city built largely of wood and paper, the fires spread quickly. Entire neighborhoods burned. Thousands died. The bombers came from bases in the Mariana Islands, islands that had been Japanese territory until a few months ago. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th had killed more people in a single night than any previous air raid in history. Over 100,000 civilians dead. 16 square miles of the city burned to ash. The heat was so intense that canals boiled. People suffocated from lack of oxygen as the fires consumed all the air. Those who jumped into water to escape the flames were boiled alive. The American bombers did this and then flew back to their bases, untouchable, unreachable, unstoppable. Admiral Toyota spoke quietly about the naval situation. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the nation, was now a shadow of its former strength. Most of the carriers were gone. Many battleships had been sunk. Fuel was so scarce that major operations were impossible. Meanwhile, American fleets sailed where they wished with apparent immunity. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, moving across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. A young captain named Sato shared reports from kamikaze pilots. Japan had begun using suicide attacks because conventional tactics no longer worked. Pilots would load their planes with explosives and crash into American ships. Some attacks succeeded. Some American vessels were damaged or sunk. But the strategy revealed Japan's desperation more than its strength. When a nation resorts to suicide attacks, it admits it has no other options left. The kamikaze strikes also revealed another harsh truth. Even suicide attacks could not change the war's outcome. Japan could sink a dozen American ships through kamikaze tactics, and 20 more would arrive to replace them. American production was simply too vast. They could absorb losses that would cripple Japan and barely slow down. It was like trying to stop an avalanche by throwing stones at it. Colonel Ishida presented intelligence about a new American weapon being developed. The information was fragmentary and difficult to verify. Scientists called it an atomic bomb. It supposedly used nuclear fission to create an explosion more powerful than thousands of tons of conventional explosives. Most officers dismissed it as science fiction or American propaganda. But some Japanese scientists confirmed that such a weapon was theoretically possible. If America actually built it, the implications were terrifying beyond imagination. General Anime finally broke his long silence and said what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to speak aloud. Japan could not win this war. Japan could never have won this war. The entire strategic calculation had been wrong from the beginning. America's industrial capacity was not just superior, it was overwhelming. Their will to fight had not weakened, it had hardened. Every Japanese victory early in the war had only made Americans more determined to win. The room remained silent after Anime's admission. Officers looked at their hands, at the maps, at anything except each other. To admit defeat went against everything they had been taught. The warrior's code demanded fighting to the death. Surrender was shameful. But what was the alternative? Continue fighting until every city burned? Until every soldier died? Until Japan itself ceased to exist? Sugiyama asked the question that had been hovering over these meetings for months. Should they approach the emperor about peace negotiations? Several officers immediately objected. The emperor's divine mission could not fail. Japan's honor demanded continued resistance. But Sugiyama pressed the point. What honor existed in watching the nation be destroyed? What divine mission was served by the death of every Japanese person? The argument grew heated. Younger officers spoke passionately about duty and honor. Older officers, who had seen more war and understood its costs, spoke about reality and survival. Outside the room, air raid sirens began to wail. American bombers were returning. The officers barely paused their discussion. Air raids had become so common that they were just background noise now, like rain or wind. Captain Tanaka, recently returned from Okinawa, described what was coming. American forces were preparing for an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Intelligence estimated over 1 million American troops would participate, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. The invasion would be larger than D-Day in Europe. Japanese forces would fight with everything they had, but the outcome was predetermined. America would win. The only question was how many people would die before Japan accepted the inevitable. The meeting ended without conclusions, because the real conclusion was too painful to speak directly. Japan needed to surrender, but could not surrender. The military code would not permit it. So the war would continue, grinding forward to its inevitable end. More cities would burn. More soldiers would die. More civilians would suffer. All because no one could bring themselves to say the simple word, surrender. That night, Sugiyama wrote a private letter to his wife. He told her to prepare for difficult times ahead. He did not specify what kind of difficulties, but she would understand. Everyone understood. The war was lost. Now, they simply waited to see how much more would be destroyed before the end finally came. The flash of light over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, changed everything. One American bomber, one bomb, an entire city erased in seconds. The reports that reached Tokyo were confused at first. A new type of bomb, witnesses said. A single explosion that destroyed everything within miles. Buildings vaporized. People turned to shadows burned onto walls. A mushroom cloud rising miles into the sky. It seemed impossible, like something from a nightmare rather than reality. 3 days later, it happened again. Nagasaki disappeared under another atomic blast. The scientists had been right. America had built the atomic bomb, and they had used it twice. The weapon that seemed like science fiction was terribly real. And if America had 2 such bombs, they likely had more. They could destroy Japanese cities one by one without ever risking a single soldier in invasion. in the Imperial Palace, the Supreme War Council met in emergency session. The room was hot and stuffy, but no one noticed. Admiral Toyota sat with his hands folded on the table, his face like stone. General Anami's military uniform was wrinkled, unusual for a man normally so precise about appearance. Field Marshal Sugiyama looked older than his years, tired beyond measure. They had been arguing for hours, but now a new factor had entered the equation. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Soviet invasion was crushing. Japanese forces in Manchuria, weakened by years of sending troops to Pacific battles, collapsed under the Soviet onslaught. Russian tanks rolled across the border in thousands. Japanese defensive lines broke almost immediately. Manchuria, which Japan had controlled for over a decade, was being conquered in days. Japan now faced enemies on all sides, with weapons it could not match and resources it did not have. General Yamazu spoke first when the council resumed its discussion. His voice was steady, but his words were bitter. Every assumption Japan had made about this war was wrong, he said. They assumed America was soft and would not fight. America fought harder than any enemy Japan had ever faced. They assumed American production capacity was exaggerated. It was actually understated. They assumed American unity would fracture under pressure. Instead, Americans came together more strongly than even they expected. The list of mistakes went on. Japan assumed its early victories would force American negotiation. Instead, each defeat made Americans more determined to achieve total victory. Japan assumed spiritual strength would overcome material weakness. But spirits could not stop bombs, could not build ships, could not train pilots fast enough to replace losses. Japan had fought with courage and honor, but courage and honor alone could not win modern wars. Admiral Toyota added his own confession. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been considered invincible. Now it barely existed. The Americans had built new fleets while destroying Japanese ones. They developed new tactics, new weapons, new strategies. The F-6F Hellcat fighter was specifically designed to counter the Zero. American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines. Carrier task forces operated with impunity off Japanese coasts. The mathematical reality was crushing. America had outbuilt, outfought, and outthought Japan at every level. The atomic bomb sat at the center of the discussion like a terrible presence. No defense existed against them. No strategy could counter them. If America chose to destroy every Japanese city with atomic weapons, nothing could stop them. The invasion would not even be necessary. They could simply burn Japan from the sky until nothing remained. Emperor Hirohito entered the room, and everyone stood immediately. His presence was rare at these meetings, but the situation demanded it. He listened to the arguments in silence. Some military officers still advocated continued resistance. Better to die fighting than to surrender, they argued. The entire population would resist an American invasion. Every man, woman, and child would become a soldier. Japan would bleed America so badly that eventually they would negotiate rather than continue the slaughter, but others disagreed. General Anami, despite his earlier advocacy for continued fighting, now spoke for peace. The atomic bombs had changed his mind. Continued resistance would not lead to negotiation. It would lead to the annihilation of the Japanese people. America had demonstrated the means and the will to destroy Japan completely. The only question was whether Japan's leaders would allow that destruction to happen. The emperor made his decision. Japan would surrender. The terms would be unconditional, as America demanded. The war was over. His voice was quiet but firm. He spoke of protecting what remained of the Japanese people, of preserving something of the nation for the future. Continued fighting served no purpose except to cause more death and destruction. Some officers wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. A few younger officers left the meeting planning rebellion, but their plans would come to nothing. The decision was made. Japan had lost. After 4 years of war, millions of deaths, and unimaginable destruction, the end had finally come on September 2nd, 1945, Japanese officials boarded the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay to sign the surrender documents. The ship was massive, one of America's new Iowa-class battleships. But it was just one ship among hundreds that filled the bay. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, support vessels stretched to the horizon. The American fleet displayed in Tokyo Bay was larger than the entire Japanese Navy had been at the war's beginning. General Yoshijiro Yamizu signed the documents with a steady hand, though his face showed the pain of the moment. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu followed. The ceremony was brief and formal. General Douglas MacArthur accepted the surrender on behalf of the Allied powers. Above, formations of American aircraft flew past, hundreds of planes demonstrating the air power that had burned Japanese cities. The message was clear. This was the power Japan had challenged. This was the power that had defeated them. After the ceremony, an old Japanese general spoke quietly to a group of younger officers. They had learned a terrible lesson, he said. They underestimated their enemy because Americans seemed different, because they seemed weak. But patience was not weakness. Industrial focus was not lack of warrior spirit. America had never been weak. They simply had not been angry yet. Japan made them angry. That was Japan's fatal mistake. The sleeping giant had awakened, and the world would never forget what happened when giants went to war.